Hello, Tuesday. Yeah, okay, I've only got 2 snips up today, and I've put the first one up really so the second one wouldn't be so lonely. Okay, because I found this rather interesting, and I admit my mind went to what I'm going to talk about here. It's Apple versus Microsoft stock prices since 1982. Now, I know we don't talk about investment and stock prices and things, but this one is enough to set anybody dreaming. dreaming. So we can imagine looking at the chart, the year 1990, we invest in the black line, which is Microsoft stock. Yes, it's an old one. Microsoft's got stock, but in 1990. And start selling out in the year 2000. So as you sell out of Microsoft, you buy into the orange one, which is Apple stock. And that goes from nothing to huge amounts. And you start selling that 10 years later as well. And you sold out about now. And you retire to a Caribbean island or a Caribbean island if you want to. But it's quite an interesting one, that, isn't it? The way Microsoft has come up and just stayed at a reasonable level, and Apple before this chart, obviously in the 70s it will have had a little up, but really hasn't taken off again since 2003. But since 2003 has basically gone from next to nothing up to 650 and come down a bit lately. Anyway, that's that one. Right, let's move on to the next one. It's from a blog called the Arthurian Economics or something. Arthur Shipman. It's a very interesting looking blog. I've only just gone to it for the first time. On the front page, it's got a little button that says new visitor or something. And if you go via that, it gives some of the posts that Arthur thinks is the into the thinking of the blog, which is quite good. And it's got an interesting feature on the first page as well, that the stimulus, presumably the Obama stimulus of 2009, is so many days into since its announcement. It's 2009, so it's however many years or days, and apparently it's still only 61% spent. It's not even 2/3 spent yet, that stimulus that was announced, which is interesting. Anyway, this blog that I've stumbled upon, it's a bit complicated. It's too complicated for me. This is graph 5, so there are 4 more, so you can go and get more into this via the other 4 and the other writings. But I've just come to the end of this article because I think that this follows us on so readily from where I left off yesterday, with the girls being employed after the 70s, 80s recessions as cheap labour because corporate profits were being squeezed. We can say mainly by increased energy prices, but just in general, corporate profits were being squeezed. So we're on graph 5. Of the other graphs, Arthur here is separating out profits from non-financial corporations and financial corporations. And they're separated out in the graphs above, but in this one they're lumped together. So we've got banks' profits, let's say, alongside car makers' profits or bread makers' profits, whichever. So we've got the entire corporate profits lumped in to make 100% according to this graph. And then we split the 100% into 2 bucket loads. One is profits made from financial sources in one bucket, and in the other is profits made from productive sources. And obviously those 2 buckets will always, added up, make 100%. because it's the 100% of profits divided into the two buckets. So when one goes up, the other one goes down, and vice versa. Vice versa. Right, so we go back to 1950, where, as we can imagine, productive profits were 60% and financial profits from financial sources was only 40%, which sounds a reasonable sort of ratio. Those ratios mixed themselves in the 70s and 80s at 50%, where half the profits of the corporates in the United States were making their money out of financial sources and half from productive sources. But ever since the 1980s recession finished and corporate profits were being squeezed, we can presume that they were mainly being squeezed on the productive sources side, and that is the blue line that's going down towards the bottom right corner, as of course pro rata the red line, the profits from financial sources, is heading up towards the top right corner. And it reached a moment of lunacy in the year 2000, with nearly 90% of profits being made from financial sources, where just over 10% of profits were being made from productive sources. Now we can say that that's got better recently in the last 12 years, but I don't think that's the way to read this chart. I think we can say that the volatility of those lines is getting more and more volatile, but the trend is still the same, either reading it from 1950 or reading it from 1980. The movement of the red line is up towards the top right corner, and the movement of the blue line is towards the bottom right corner. That is the trend. If you extend the trend line out in a straight line, you can see the chart will just about be finishing when it's back up into the corners again. So it's heading towards the corporate profits increasingly being made from financial sources and less being made from productive sources. Now, this is where we have to do some screwing up of the face. Now, we've got bank profits in there, obviously, and there are other corporates like GE and GM that make money out of financial sources, out of lending and whatever. But obviously GE and GM make profits out of productive sources as well. But we can presume that they have and will try and continue to make more profits out of the financial sources, because they're the ones that are on the up and up. But how on earth will they be able to, with zero interest rate policy and the spread that you can make lending money being constricted? We must surely presume that corporate profits are going to go down unless they can make more money out of their financial sources, because they certainly don't seem to be making it out of their productive sources. And that's a long-term trend over this entire graph, that they're making less and less out of productive sources. We'd have to have two big revelations how there could be an upturn in profits from productive sources, where we go back to Izzy's idea, where they're not going to get it out of productive sources, and our own thinking, which my mind obviously is a bit loose on this. It can't quite grasp it because I don't understand the entirety of what profits that can be made from financial sources, but surely that trend can't continue either. So we can imagine that corporate profits are in dire trouble. And if corporate profits are in dire trouble, employment will be in dire trouble, etc., etc. I'm pretty convinced that this chart is the appropriate carry-on from yesterday's line of thinking. Corporate profits are being squeezed and squeezed. They've taken advantage of what they could by getting extra profits out of financial sources, but that must surely be constricted due to zero interest rate policies and people borrowing less. and can you see any way that the trend line in profits from productive sources can turn up? We can imagine that those lines will continue out to their appropriate corners, but the actual number, the actual pie that's being divided, the 100% of profits, will actually be getting less and less. I'm pretty convinced that this is an important chart, so I'll leave it with you to think about it. Crowdsource the thinking on this to see where we go next. Leave it with you. Thanks, bye.